Okay, well, I'll take questions. I always think it's good to laugh a bit first.
You could discuss acupuncture.
Could we discuss acupuncture for Parkinson's disease? Well, I have some experience with it in Parkinson's disease, and unfortunately was not helpful. When I was at the University of Miami, there was a Chinese traditional physician who also was a physiologist. Now, he did research in the lab, but he did on the side, he had his own acupuncture clinic. So he convinced me to refer patients to him with various aspects of Parkinson's disease. So I sent him patients with tremor, sent him patients who had a lot of kind of dystonic posturing. And those are the two types of patients that I thought maybe acupuncture would benefit. And unfortunately, neither tremor nor dystonia benefited from acupuncture. And they went over a series of treatments. There have been other people who've looked at acupuncture for Parkinson's disease. It's not useful at all. It is one condition where acupuncture is useful. If there's a lot of pain, it's a useful procedure for pain and if you want to avoid taking pain medication. And there is some pain associated with Parkinson's disease. A lot of people have end-of-dose painful sensations in their legs or in their arms. Maybe acupuncture would be helpful, but before even doing acupuncture, I would say try to adjust the medication so you don't wear off and experience that wearing off pain.
How you doing?
Hi.
Have you heard anything about experimentation going on right now, where they're taking skin cells and implanting them in the lesions of monkey brains, and getting positive results of the monkeys, rhesus monkeys losing their Parkinson's?
Well, monkeys do respond better than people when, with cell transplant studies. For example, the original work with fetal cell transplants was done in monkeys, and that led to humans. And there were a lot of fetal cell grafts in humans, over 200 cases. But I've talked about this before. Those fetal cells do improve the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, but they end up having, the patients end up having the same difficulties as chronic levodopa, namely wearing off, excessive dyskinesias, the involuntary movements triggered by levodopa. Even when they stopped the levodopa, they would have these excessive involuntary movements that we call runaway dyskinesias, because typically you can lower the Sinemet and those dyskinesias will go away. But they didn't, because those fetal cells had matured into dopamine neurons, were making dopamine constantly and releasing it in an unregulated fashion. So and those patients ended up having to have pallidotomy. So no one is doing fetal cell grafting. The stem cell biologists have gone back to the board, and there was a problem with embryonic stem cells. Now, fetal cells are not embryonic stem cells. Remember, stem cells are defined from where the tissue is taken from and what stage of development. So if you take cells from a 6 to 10-week-old fetus from the midbrain, those are fetal cells. They're not truly stem cells. They're committed to become dopamine neurons. No one is doing that work anymore because there's just not enough fetal cells. If it worked dramatically, there's no way to get enough fetuses because of ethical and moral concerns, because you need it to get those from therapeutic abortions. However, embryonic stem cells are taken from fertilized eggs. This is in the past. And you can get embryonic stem cell lines that could be put into the brain of Parkinson's disease patients. But in monkeys, it worked very well. If you took an embryonic stem cell and you kind of pre-differentiate them so they're destined to become neurons, and then you transplant them into the striatum of monkeys, the monkeys performed really well. And these are monkeys with hemi-Parkinsonism. Not quite the same as Parkinson's disease, because in all animal models, it's an artificial form of Parkinson's disease made by destroying dopaminergic neurons with a toxicant. So, and if you don't pre-differentiate these cells and start them towards the path of neuronal development, if you put them in as embryonic stem cells, then you can get really serious problems because they form hamartomas or tumor-like cells. So no one is talking about embryonic stem cells for humans. And the issue with the monkey and pre-committed cells is that it would produce the same difficulty as putting in fetal cells. In other words, runaway dyskinesias, and it doesn't reconstruct the real problem. Remember, the problem in Parkinson's disease that everyone's focusing on is what we know the most about, which is dopamine deficiency. But the illness is much broader than that. So even if you were able to replace the dopamine system, you wouldn't solve all the difficulties. For example, gait and balance problems, those happen independent of the dopamine deficiency syndrome.
Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah. Yes, but let me go on further with the skin. So embryonic stem cells are problematic also because there are a lot of people who object because of their belief system that embryonic stem cells are immoral because these are fertilized eggs. These are potentially human beings. The way that works is that individuals who have in vitro fertilization, they make a lot of fertilized eggs, most of which are frozen. Only a few are used for implantation into the woman who wants to have a child, who's had problems with fertility. The other eggs, fertilized eggs, can be used for research if people have signed the right documents and have informed consent. But there are a lot of people who object to that. And there was a ban on embryonic stem cells. Developing new ones, there was permission to use the established lines, but those established lines aren't very useful. You couldn't use federal monies to use embryonic stem cell research. So the next step, what's happened in the stem cell arena is that one can take skin fibroblasts. They're easy to prepare and they grow like mad. It's a very rapidly proliferating cell. And you can induce an embryonic stem cell-like cell. It isn't a true embryonic cell, but it has the entire genome of the donor. So a person who has Parkinson's disease might be able to donate his fibroblast. They can induce those cells to go backwards in terms of their fate. Now, a fibroblast is not a stem cell. A fibroblast can't become any cell. It just can become, it divides and divides. And fibroblasts are what happen when you cut your skin and you start getting a healing process. Well, fibroblasts are involved in the repair of skin. Fibroblasts are connective tissue all over the body. And many fibroblasts originate in the bone marrow, so people are also using bone marrow-derived mesenchymal stem cells, which become fibroblasts. But to take a skin cell and to put in a few genes into that skin cell causes the cell to de-differentiate, to go back to a more primitive state. And once they're in a primitive state, you can coax them to become neurons. So that way you avoid the moralists, those, I say moralists because they're arguing on the basis of good and evil. They're arguing on the basis of what they believe in the biblical sense. They're arguing on the basis that life begins at the moment of fertilization. The human soul takes on a body at the moment of fertilization, although the Catholic doctrine said the human soul doesn't occur until the moment of quickening, which is when the mother feels the baby kicking. And there was a big debate. No one really knew when the soul took on a body. And you may argue that there is no such thing as a soul. So anyway, that's what's holding up embryonic stem cell research, people's concepts of what is life, when does it begin. The church and governments get involved at critical times in our lives. The moment of birth, the moment of death. There's all kinds of rituals that we have. And everything has to do with dying is tightly regulated. Like think of all the things we do when someone dies. And what is death? Does the soul leave the body, etc.? I'm getting off on a tangent. I'm sorry, but these tangents are what hold up embryonic stem cell research. Because the real solution is going to be recapitulating development from the moment of birth. And so we need to be able to study human embryonic stem cells. Because the problem isn't just putting in dopamine neurons. It has to be a redevelopment of whole parts of the brain in a very natural way, just like development occurs during normal development of the nervous system. We know that you could stimulate the birth of a whole new spinal cord in certain organisms, like a salamander, a newt, a zebrafish. But we can't do that in a human. And the way it works in an animal is that those mesenchymal stem cells come to the site of the injury, where I made a lesion, cut across the spinal cord, or made a hole in the brain of the salamander. Those mesenchymal stem cells go to the site, and they form a mass called a blastema that looks like embryonic stem cells. And they de-differentiate, and then they re-differentiate, not just to neurons, but to every cell type that makes up the leg, or the spinal cord. And until we understand that, forget about stem cells. So what you're talking about, hearing about, you get skin fibroblasts, in cell culture. The beauty is it does have your own DNA, so it's unlikely to be rejected. And you can make them into cells that look like embryonic stem cells. But we don't have enough information as to how embryonic stem cells can reconstruct the injured nervous system. We don't know how. We don't understand the process. We don't understand how a fertilized egg becomes you and me. We don't understand that process if you think of how complicated it is. It takes 9 months just to get to the baby size, and still the nervous system is developing. And it's not till you're 25 years of age that the nervous system is finally developed.
I didn't know.
And it's when you develop the forebrain, it's the final part of the brain, the latest stages of development and of evolution. It's what gives us foresight, planning ahead, these very important human characteristics. And it's what allows you to control your impulses. And so young adults often are very impulsive, emotional, and get into all kinds of trouble because they're not planning ahead. It takes about mid-20s. I know from personal experience, I didn't really have a forebrain until I was 25. And then I went back to university. I gave up all my bohemian ways.
Well, not all.
Well, most of them. So I think there is a lot of hope to continue research with embryonic stem cells. What takes a while is for society to change their ways. I think the scientists will move faster than society will approve. Just like Galileo, all his observations of the planets moving, and he had evidence that the Earth rotated around the sun. Wow, did he get in trouble? He ended up in jail. He was a heretic. So, anyone who uses embryonic stem cells to reconstruct a human brain is going to get in a lot of trouble. The federal government will go after him. The evangelical Christians will go after him. So the Catholics, not so much. I don't think the Jews will go after him either. There's nowhere in the Bible that says that life begins at the moment of fertilization. Right? So anyway, that's my lecture and off the pulpit from embryonic stem cells.
Some states have legalized marijuana. Would marijuana help a Parkinson patient?
That's a really interesting question, because I am a proponent of marijuana for use for control of certain movement disorders. So in the 19th century, it was a standard treatment. So when it was introduced into England in 1845, it was a Dr. O'Shaughnessy, an Irishman assigned to the British forces in India. And he noticed that in India they used it quite often for tremulous disorders and for anxiety. And they used it in various ways in India. It's been used for thousands of years. They used it as an extract of alcohol. And so they had a tincture of cannabis indica. Cannabis is the botanical genus name for, quote, marijuana. And indica because it was from India, but the common varieties are cannabis sativa, which we get in the United States. And it's just a naturally growing plant. And it's very rich in a resin that contains about 19 different cannabinoids. These are substances from cannabis. And when they're extracted into alcohol, they're very stable, and they can be put into beverages. So you could put so many thimblefuls of cannabis indica extract called O'Shaughnessy's elixir into a drink. It could be wine, it could be tea, it could be food. And that was recommended, and it was how can I say, codified in a manual of neurology written in 1880 in England called the Manual of Neurology by William Gowers. And there's 2 pages on the use of cannabis indica for the tremor and rigidity of Parkinson's disease. And it had been allowed to be used that way till 1937, when it was finally taken because of pressure from the Bureau of Dangerous and Narcotic Drugs that had moved marijuana into one of the #1 prohibited substances. They pressured everyone, the federal government, to remove it, and the AMA. The AMA resisted, believe it or not, the removal of marijuana from the pharmacopoeia, from drugs that could be prescribed. They can't be prescribed now, except for now 18 states and Washington, D.C. Now, what I have in my, I guess I can talk about it. I have received I'm a reviewer of many journals, neurology journals. I just received a paper that has a really nice study of extract of cannabis. It came from Israel, where, by the way, I'm going to tell you why Israel is very important in the cannabis story in just a moment. And it showed that it was very, very effective in alleviating rigidity, tremor, and antidepressant effects. Very common. There's a depression associated with Parkinson's disease. It's part and parcel of the illness. And so people's moods were elevated when they were it was double-blind, placebo-controlled. So this paper, I'm gonna, probably it'll be published and it'll help support the reintroduction of cannabis preparations. Now, cannabis is very important in Israel because it was Dr. Meshullam, who was from Israel, was the first to identify the endogenous cannabinoids in the brain. It turns out that we all make cannabis compounds called endogenous or cannabinoids. They look different than marijuana, though. The chemical structure of the component that produces the most psychoactive effect is called delta-9 THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. It's an alcohol, it has a little alcohol group attached to the chemical structure. And he identified an agent called anandamide, which is Hindu for bliss or joy, that is produced by neurons and that acts on cannabis receptors in the brain. And then we know that in Parkinson's disease, there's a dropout of the cannabis production endogenous. So it makes sense to try to replace the cannabinoids by exogenous purposes. So that gives more rationale for using it. So we are all cannabis heads. We're all marijuana heads because we produce this. And in the case of Huntington's, which is another movement disorder, they drop out cells that have cannabis receptors. So they don't even respond to cannabis in the right way. But as I understand it, there's no dropout of cannabis receptors. In other words, the lock on the door that the cannabis fits in to open the door, it allows you to function, is still there. What's missing is the endogenous cannabinoids are diminishing. So how do cannabinoids work? Well, they modulate. They're considered neuromodulators. So if there is a disorder where there's too much dopamine being produced, like in choreiform disorders, the cannabinoids dampen the release. If there's disorder where there's not enough dopamine being released, it upregulates the dopamine release. So it's a very nice adjunct to levodopa therapy, I believe. Unfortunately, the biggest use for cannabis in those 18 states that have medical marijuana in their books, that have been voted upon by the states, by the people, and it goes contrary to the federal government regulations, which states it's a Schedule I drug and there's no medical use for it. The paradox is that the NIH has a patent on the use of cannabinoids as neuroprotective agents, but the FDA and DEA say there's no medical use. So it's like, fortunately, it's a bipartisan move now to allow cannabis to be used medically, even in the state of Florida, which I thought would take forever. In the state of Florida, there's going to be a bill before the legislature to allow medical marijuana. which will be amazing. And what we're doing, I'm having a conference next May in Denver, which is, there are 2 states that allow it to be used recreationally. And it's being regulated like alcohol. It's taxed. You have to be over 21 to buy it. You can't drive, and you're subject to, to Colorado and Washington, state of Washington. So I, as a pharmacologist and interested in ethnopharmacology, have been very aware of the history of cannabis as a pharmacological agent for treatment of a number of conditions. The biggest use in those states, though, isn't for Parkinson's disease or movement disorders. It's for pain. It was always considered to be the poor man's opiate. It's better in a sense in opiates because there's no physical dependence. People do get psychologically dependent on cannabis. In other words, they use it regularly and then suddenly don't use it. They kind of wish they had some and they think about it and want to get some more. But there's no sickness that ensues. Unlike opiate dependence, where you use it chronically and you stop using it, you not only crave it, but you have a sickness which consists of, cramps, diarrhea, agitation, that kind of thing. That doesn't happen with cannabis. Cannabis is also the safest of all of these drugs. There's never been anyone who took an overdose of cannabis. It just puts you to sleep if you take too much. Whereas it doesn't suppress respiration like opiates, which is a big deal. So I think that you'll hear more about it. In Czechoslovakia, they did a survey of people with Parkinson's disease use cannabis. It turned out about 15% of the Czechoslovakian population is using cannabis as an adjunct to treatment of their Parkinson's disease. So yeah, I think and there is a company called GW Pharmaceuticals that has a preparation of cannabis extract, and it's 50% delta-9 THC, 50% cannabidiol, which is the neuroprotective component. Delta-9 THC is the psychoactive component, and it's called Sativex. And it's an oral mucosal spray. It tastes like mint, like a mint refresher, mouth refresher. And it's absorbed through the mucous membranes. It's not inhaled. And it's a metered amount, so you can adjust dosage. One of the reasons the FDA doesn't like the plant, and probably pharmaceutical companies kind of have their own motivation. But if you have the plant, everyone could grow it. So what happens in these illegal states, if you have an indication, you can grow X number of plants in your house legally. But the fact is, if we're going to use a drug, we like to know how much, how often. And so I think the future of cannabis for Parkinson's disease will not rely on your home brewed beverages or preparations, because it takes a certain amount of expertise and so forth. And I'm not a proponent of smoking, and many of people who talk about using it for Parkinson's, it's not through smoking or vaporizing, but through some oral delivery form that you can adjust just right to alleviate the symptoms. Cookies, yeah, that's, well, the other, that's Alice B. Toklas. Yeah. But then there's many indications for the use of cannabis. I think the conference that I'm going to be speaking at, I'm organizing it for, it's called Cannabis Patients Union, and they realize that many physicians don't know anything about cannabis. And so this is for CME credit being done in Denver next May. I've organized a number of speakers, including a few from Israel, to speak on the use of cannabis for a number of medical conditions. And secondly, what we'll be focusing, my talk will be on how we could do this for Parkinson's disease, what would be the most intelligent way to use it. And ideally, this company called GW Pharmaceutics, it has meant the equivalent of the FDA in Canada, it's Canada Health, that regulates all drugs. They've approved Sativex, that oral mucosal marijuana preparation, for painful neuropathies, and for which is pain in the limbs related to peripheral neuropathy, and a number of other indications. So if you were a Canadian, you could have that prescribed, and it's an oral mucosal spray. I think that is how it's going to finally get into the US, because then there's no one going to object to it. It's a medication, It's through a drug company, it's metered, it's a dose kind of adjustments, whereas if it's just a plant you grow in your home, they worry that it'll be diverted, that 12-year-old kids will start smoking and they'll all become gangsters. It's that kind of thing. Anyway, I'll be glad to take another.
You had said that the gait and balance is not really relative to the dopamine. How does...
I should clarify that because it is a very important point. Now, in the days before levodopa, carbidopa, dopamine replacement, eventually people very quickly lost the ability to rise from a chair and walk. When levodopa was introduced, it was very effective in alleviating slowness of movement and rigidity, so people could get up and walk a lot better than in the days without levodopa. So to that extent, the extent to which slowness and rigidity impair walking and movement, that's the extent to which levodopa will improve walking and movement. So dopamine does alleviate slowness and rigidity, and walking requires that you not be slow and rigid, right? However, as the disease progresses, people begin to have these sudden immobile periods that have nothing to do with levels of dopamine. So you can be on a really good dose of levodopa, and you can suddenly freeze and just fall. There's gait ignition, where you get up and you can't initiate the movement. You're on very good levels of dopamine. And then the postural instability, where any little shift in your center of gravity and you fall. Those are all independent of dopamine. So when you get to stage 3 of Parkinson's disease, when you're beginning to fall, because stage 1 is one-sided signs and symptoms of slowness and rigidity and tremor. Stage 2 is both sides. Stage 3 is when you are losing your postural reflexes. Those do not respond, that loss of postural stability and gait ignition and sudden immobility doesn't respond very well, if at all, to dopamine replacement. And importantly, doesn't respond to deep brain stimulation.
Doesn't?
So if you're falling, don't think that deep brain stimulation is going to improve it. Now, there are some experimental targets deeper in the brainstem that are being used to improve gait and balance. And that's a big breakthrough for the deep brain stimulators, because we don't have a drug right now that will improve that loss of balance, because it's not related to the dopamine system. You have to understand that the illness involves all levels of the brain and more than just dopamine. The only reason we've focused since 1960 on dopamine because it's the only thing that we could work with. It's like you lost your keys to your car and you parked in the lot and you were at the bar and you're walking and you say, oh my God, where are my keys? So where's the first place you look? Under the light. Because what's the point of looking if it's dark? So we're looking under the light because that's where we found that's where we found stuff about dopamine. That was where we were illuminated. But the key to this illness could be somewhere between your car and the door to the bar.
Good morning. There are two questions I have. One, I was online the other day, and there are a number of studies that are asking for volunteers. Many of them, I assume, are up at University of South Florida Parkinson Research. At this point, my husband is not available for any studies. But should he or should we register for the possible studies? And the second question I have is, I had read also online that scopolamine, which is typically used for seasickness or motion sickness, was good for, or was another additional treatment or possible treatment for drooling.
In terms of clinical studies, yes. The place where there are the greatest number of clinical studies is at the University of South Florida. My colleague, Dr. Bob Hauser, is doing all the clinical studies. And there are a number of them. One of the ones that's of interest would involve a new class of drugs called adenosine antagonists. They work a bit like caffeine works, basically. And supposedly they would decrease the likelihood of dyskinesias or would be good to filling in the off periods. And there's a lot still that has to be learned about the adenosine antagonists, but there are clinical trials with those drugs. The other there is always a need for de novo patients. These are individuals who were just diagnosed but have not yet been treated with levodopa. Because once you're treated with levodopa, it primes the system for dyskinesias, even if you only got treatment for a week or two. So the idea is, so if you register you call the University of South Florida and ask for an appointment with Dr. Bob Hauser to be enrolled. I can also, what I should do is have a list of drug studies so I could give you. For next time I talk, I'll have some studies that they're recruiting for. Now, scopolamine is nothing but an anticholinergic drug, and all of you who pay attention to me know that anticholinergic drugs, scopolamine, artane, cogentin, these are drugs that block the acetylcholine receptor. Now, in the 19th century, along with cannabis, the other major drug were the belladonna alkaloids. So I have to give you the history. Belladonna alkaloids were used especially for tremor, but they were kind of dangerous drugs. They had a bad reputation. Number one, the Borgias used belladonna alkaloids to poison their enemies, in the Renaissance. Number two is that it can cause hallucinations, flying, and delusions and delirium. And the story is that many of the witch potions, they would put belladonna alkaloids into the brew, and that would be one of the reasons that they believed they could fly on a broomstick. so belladonna alkaloids are that. But it turns out that belladonna alkaloids were known for drying secretions, because it gives you a dry mouth, big pupils, that it was introduced in 1860 for the tremor of Parkinson's disease, because they found that, wow, it helped tremor. So we use safer compounds. We don't use the belladonna alkaloids. The people who use belladonna alkaloids now are college students who see the angel trumpet, which is a belladonna relative, and they'll make a tea from it and end up in an emergency room and can die. It's very, very toxic. And they were using it to alter their consciousness. In the Amazon, belladonna alkaloids, Brugmansia species, are relative to, they're similar to angel trumpet. Every shaman in the Amazon has an angel trumpet-like plant outside his door. It's like the red and white barbershop sign. That's how you know where the local doctor is, the local shaman doctor. And they use belladonna alkaloids as part of their healing ritual, along with a whole bunch of other mind-altering substances. But getting back to scopolamine, yes, it has some mild anti-nausea effects. It dries secretions, and it can help tremor. What's the downside of artane, cogentin, and scopolamine for Parkinson's disease? It works for slowness and tremor. I'm sorry, not for slowness, for tremor in particular. Helps a little bit with rigidity, not much. The major side effect of these anticholinergic drugs is to produce the problem that Alzheimer's patients have, because Alzheimer's don't have enough acetylcholine, right? And they develop short-term memory problems and cognitive problems. When you add an anticholinergic, you're going to have short-term memory problems. And anyone over 60 is more prone to be more forgetful, which is part of the normal, unless you run 3 to 5 miles 5 times a week, then you won't lose short-term memory. That's another incentive, because you increase the production of hippocampal neuron. But anyway, I don't like to use belladonna alkaloids, that's artane, cogentin, to treat tremor in people over 60. And if they're a man, it's even worse, because one of the side effects is to inhibit the bladder, which is really good if you're peeing all the time. And we use ditropan, which blocks acetylcholine receptors, because it just works locally. It doesn't get into the brain. But the artane cogentin block works centrally, as does scopolamine, and can cause worse constipation, because it inhibits the movement of the gut, urinary retention, short-term memory, and precipitate hallucinations. So, yes, those anticholinergics are useful, usually in people less than 60 who have tremor-predominant illness that doesn't need yet levodopa for slowness and rigidity. So I still use it, but very few people over 60. And when I do, I write in the note, be very, very cautious. If you're more forgetful, don't take it. If you're starting to have problems with emptying the bladder, don't take it. If you start seeing witches or flying creatures, don't take it. Back up. So, well, let's spread it out, because I know I could spend a lot of time just
I know.
back and
I have a
forth.
simple question.
Well, they're all simple.
Well, I know from past experience that Dr. Hauser recommends Mirapex. With him, the word Cinemet never entered into it, at least in my case. How do you feel with respect to Mirapex versus Cinemet?
Well, the Mirapex is a synthetic dopamine. The advantage of Mirapex is that it's not infected by your diet, whereas levodopa, carbidopa, eventually you're going to notice that after a meal rich in protein, the levodopa doesn't work as well. And in the beginning, you don't have to worry about that. So Mirapex is one that you can add on to a regimen when people are wearing off and you're concerned about the effect of diet on levodopa. But there's a general principle we follow about when to use levodopa and when to use a synthetic dopamine. There are several synthetic dopamines. I could say synthetic, but those are called dopamine agonists. They're small chemicals that act like dopamine. They interact with the dopamine receptor, and they can penetrate from stomach, blood to brain fairly easily. Whereas levodopa has a number, it's a natural amino acid, it's all kinds of side pathways that interfere with its getting into dopamine. And as the illness advances, you have less capacity to store dopamine from levodopa. As the illness advances, you still have dopamine receptors, so the agonists continue to be useful. So there's another issue about levodopa besides diet. Levodopa, when it's started young and used frequently, will cause levodopa-induced dyskinesias and motor fluctuations that are like a roller coaster in some people. You're on with dyskinesias, then you're off, and you're immobile, then you're on. And so an agonist sometimes helps. If you're less than 60, that's just an artificial cutoff point. But that's the one that most movement disorder neurologists use. And you need symptomatic relief. In other words, you need to improve your signs and symptoms so you don't lose your job, so you can perform everyday activities. We would start with an agonist. So I would use Mirapex, or I would use Requip, or bromocriptine, or in the old days, Pergolide. Those are effective in alleviating slowness and rigidity and a little bit of tremor. And you don't need to use levodopa. We reserve the levodopa to the point where the Mirapex isn't working as well anymore after many years of being on it. And you keep on increasing the dose because that's what the usual course of the illness is. So Mirapex is perfectly fine, especially if you're starting to be treated for your symptom relief before 60. If you're over 60, and you can start also with Mirapex, you can then add levodopa. You get by with a lot less levodopa. So there's an advantage to starting off with Mirapex, that you can reserve the levodopa for a bit later, and you would probably need less levodopa. And since you haven't started with levodopa, you haven't primed the system for dyskinesias. Now, once you bring on the levodopa, you will eventually develop dyskinesias. At least 50 to 70% of patients will. So there's nothing wrong with the Mirapex. The major side effect, it's more likely to produce hallucinations than levodopa. It's the most potent of the agonists. You get by with 1.1 milligram 3 times a day, whereas Requip, you need about 8 milligrams 3 times a day. The Nupro patch is the one that I'm using a lot. If you don't get rashes from it and you don't sweat like a lot, it's a fantastic drug because it results in very constant delivery of the drug through the skin to the blood and doesn't fluctuate. The Mirapex will fluctuate too. So you still have on and off periods with Mirapex, even with the extended release Mirapex. So the latest dopamine agonist is the one I prefer. I say latest, is the one we have the only one we have available that can be delivered without going through the gastrointestinal system, bypassing the liver, bypassing all those things that result in uneven levels in the blood. Because even Mirapex, though it can get into the brain, the levels in the brain are going like this. Because you take it 4 times a day, 3 times a day. So the levels are never going to be the same, whereas the transdermal rotigotine, brand name Nupro, result in very steady levels. And so someone less than 60 who needs symptomatic relief, I prefer to use the Nupro patch. The downside of Nupro, it's still a hassle with your insurance companies. So I met with one of the people higher up, and they say they're renegotiating with Medicare and the insurance companies about having it covered under your drug plans. So eventually, the price is going to be more reasonable to your insurance company. Right now, it's very, very expensive. So that's one of the hesitations I have about prescribing it. You'll see how well it works, and then you see, my God, it's costing me so much money. The advantage, of course, is that you take it once a day. And it's wonderful, and you can usually get by with less levodopa, carbidopa.
If you started out on Mirapex, which he did, and now he's on Cinemet,
But you should,
but he
typically,
does have some rigidity and some dyskinesia. Now, if you took Mirapex in addition to the Cinemet, would that help? Like Kathy's question was, with the gait and balance, if the Cinemet doesn't do that, is there something else you can
he still has a
take?
lot of slowness and rigidity.
Yeah.
What I do when people have continuing slowness and rigidity is either increase the levodopa, but if he gets a lot more dyskinesias, you can't do that, then you have the Mirapex and you work up the
So you
Mirapex.
could take both of them?
Yeah, all the time. In
Okay.
fact, this illness is polypharmacy. You don't use only one drug for the rest of your life with this. You need a combination. In the beginning, you can get by with one drug. So he was on Mirapex first, and then he wasn't doing as well. I would have added the levodopa, and you would get by with less levodopa.
Okay.
So yeah, the combination, levodopa is, let me go over this again, this is very important. Levodopa is a naturally occurring component of protein. Levodopa is one of the 20 amino acids that make up all proteins. Levodopa is used by your body to make new proteins, and we're constantly replacing proteins. But levodopa is also a building block for a number of neurotransmitters, including adrenaline, noradrenaline, and dopamine. So when you don't make enough dopamine in your neurons because of the illness, you can load the system with this naturally occurring amino acid called levodopa. And enough of it will get into the brain where it's metabolized into dopamine by your remaining dopamine neurons, and it's very effective to replace the missing dopamine. The problem is levodopa by itself, no one ever takes levodopa by itself anymore unless you're from India, where you can get it in the form of mucuna pruriens, a pod, a bean-like substance where they make extracts, and it's very rich in levodopa and it's very cheap. The problem is you have to take 8 to 10 grams of levodopa. Do you know what a gram is? Well, think of 25, 100, it's 100 milligrams of levodopa, as opposed to 1,000 milligrams in 1 gram. Because you have to take 8,000 milligrams amounts of levodopa to get any benefit. And this is the reason that levodopa caused so much nausea and vomiting. And only people who had an iron stomach and were resistant to the nausea were able to get high enough doses of levodopa in the 1960s that they could then finally have this incredible benefit. Why does it take so much? Well, because levodopa, when it gets from the gut and goes through the gut lining into the liver, it's chopped up by enzymes that break down amino acids. So it's broken down by an enzyme called peripheral decarboxylase. It basically takes all the CO2 from the end of it. And it becomes dopamine. And dopamine is further metabolized and eliminated in the urine. But that circulating dopamine triggers nausea and vomiting. The area of the brain that is responsible for your throwing up and sensing nausea is at the junction of the blood-brain barrier. So circulating dopamine, it can't get across the blood-brain barrier because it's a charged compound. Levodopa can cross the blood-brain barrier, but if most of the levodopa is made into dopamine in the blood and liver, that dopamine, all it does is trigger nausea and vomiting and can't penetrate the blood-brain barrier. However, very smart pharmacologists realize that if they inhibit or prevent or block the metabolism of levodopa in the gut and in the liver by adding a decoy called carbidopa. Carbidopa looks like levodopa, and it kind of runs like, I guess, like an offensive tackle or whatever, and blocks the way and paves the way for levodopa to get into the brain. What it does is occupy all of those metabolic enzymes that break down levodopa, because it looks like levodopa, but then it binds with those enzymes and allows levodopa to get through into the brain, so you can reduce the amount of levodopa with carbidopa to 100 milligrams or or 250 milligrams. Basically, a lot less levodopa needs to be taken, and there's a lot less nausea and vomiting. That's why it was called no vomit. It was patented by Merck as no vomit. Of course, we don't call anything no vomit. Latin for no vomit is sin emesis. Sin emesis, if you have any mind, you see drop the S and add a T, you have cinnamon. So cinnamon is nothing but a naturally occurring amino acid with a blocker of peripheral metabolism, and it was designed to allow you to take levodopa without getting sick. So I hope no one asks me about this again, because it's very important to realize that levodopa is a very natural compound, but you take it in big doses. No one ever takes that amount of levodopa in their diet unless you're from India. And you do that on purpose because it's very cheap. Now, the reason that's important to understand is that other proteins that have amino acids that resemble levodopa, for example, just a glass of milk, there's at least 4 different amino acids in milk and in all proteins that are transported into the brain through the same gateway as levodopa. Because levodopa has to be enter the brain through a special portal called the neutral amino acid transporter. And so the proteins that you eat can occupy those transporters and prevent levodopa that you've taken in your pill from getting into the blood and into the brain. So that's why, as the illness advances, and you need every molecule of levodopa to be in your brain, you start paying attention to your diet a bit, because you'll notice that after a meal in which you had protein and you just have to take your levodopa a half hour before your meal, for the 2 hours, 2.5 to 3 hours after the meal, the levodopa won't seem as effective. It's because you're not getting enough into the brain. In the beginning of the illness, you have enough dopamine storage capacity that even though a lot of the meals are blocking levodopa, you just need some of the levodopa to get there, where it's converted in your neurons into dopamine and stored in little vesicles. But as the illness advances, your ability to store levodopa in the form of dopamine in the brain diminishes, and your clinical response, in other words, your ability to move, your slowness and rigidity being attenuated, is a function of circulating levels of levodopa, which determines how much is getting into the brain. So, in simple summary, levodopa, carbidopa, cinnamon, can be taken in the early stages of the illness for quite a while without worrying about what you're eating. As the illness advances, I'd say by the 5th year of the illness, then diet becomes important. But by then, we're already using dopamine agonists because we're noticing that you're fluctuating partly because of the meal, right? Partly because of the illness advancing, and then we begin to use agonists as an adjunct. Agonist is synthetic dopamine that can get across the blood-brain barrier, that occupy the receptors. So it's a very simple, we call an algorithm. You are diagnosed with Parkinson's disease because you have slowness of movement, rigidity, plus or minus tremor. If those symptoms bother you in functioning, in other words, you're going to lose your job as a salesman because you can't fill out all these forms or work the keyboard because your right hand is too slow and rigid, then it's worth starting symptomatic therapy, even if you're 45 or 50. But in those people, I would use a dopamine agonist because they're less than 60. They're going to be on anti-Parkinson medicines for the rest of their life. So you start off with an agonist, say the Nupro patch, something simple. If tremor is predominant and they're less than 60, I might use an anticholinergic, Artane Progen, or Amantadine. If a person is less than 60, has symptoms, I say you have what looks like the beginnings of Parkinson's syndrome, but your symptoms aren't really interfering with your everyday activities. The tremor, every now and then, just put it in your pocket, it goes away. It's on your left hand, you can do everything normally around the house and at your work. I wouldn't start with symptomatic therapy until you need it to alleviate the disabilities that you have. If you have no disability from the tremor, slowness, and rigidity, you don't need levodopa, carbidopa, agonists, or anticholinergics, or anything. What you should be on at that stage would be a neuroprotective agent. And it could be either selegiline or Azilect, which is rasagiline. Rasagiline is Azilect, one of the more expensive drugs. And there is some evidence it may delay the need for dopamine replacement, so it may slow down the process. Coenzyme Q10, greater than 900 milligrams a day, is considered a neuroprotectant. Cannabis is considered a neuroprotectant. The delta cannabidiol which if you vote, and I'm saying this because the course I'm giving in May in Denver is designed for people, it's about cannabinoids in aging and health. So we need people that weren't from the hippie generation who are all for medical marijuana, but we need people of the senior class, and I'm in the senior class, who understand the benefits of cannabis. That's why I keep on talking about it to this group and to a lot of people. Because you will have a chance to vote, hopefully, soon. Yes?
What symptoms does the cannabis, not necessarily the smoking kind, the one that eventually I think will pass, help? What symptoms does it lower?
Well, what symptoms would cannabis be useful for? What it was useful for, because I've never ever, I can't prescribe it in the state of Florida. I can't even as a physician at the VA or even in my office. This is a special group, this is Parkinson Place, so I can have an opinion without getting into trouble. People don't mind hearing my opinions, whereas I have to be very careful because if I support a political agenda wearing a VA hat or a state of Florida hat,
You're in trouble.
yeah. So I have, but in any case, since I've never recommended it, I've heard others who have, I've read about it, it's especially good for tremors, slowness, and rigidity. It's good for the three major symptoms. And that's what it was recommended for. I mean, ideally they were saying the belladonna alkaloids are better for tremor than cannabis. The cannabis was better for slowness and rigidity. And of course the mood elevating effect, the appetite enhancing effects as well. The form in which it's going to be given, I think eventually is going to be an oral mucosal spray. I think if you eat it, it's hard to control when the effects will kick in. And the major downside of cannabis that the antagonists of medical marijuana say is, number one, is that it can interfere with short-term memory, which is ironic because there's evidence that actually enhances memory in certain studies. So I think that's controversial. So anything that would interfere with your cognitive functioning or decision-making would be frowned upon. But every one of the drugs we use for Parkinson's disease, I mean, levodopa, dopamine agonists are hallucinogens. And in fact, I've written an article about the use of hallucinogen at low doses to treat Parkinson's disease. That was the story of banisterine. And anyone who's interested in that, this was an Amazonian vine that was part of a hallucinogenic beverage that in 1929, Louis Levin, who's a Prussian-German father of modern pharmacology, he isolated the active agent and thought it would be good for Parkinson's disease at low doses because it didn't elicit alterations in consciousness. And there were clinical studies that went on and in Germany up until 1930. And Levin died, and he was a Jew in Germany. He wasn't allowed to hold a university position, and his work was put down. But I remember coming across those writings and had them translated into English. And I wrote this article called Banisterine and Parkinson's Disease, calling for more research on this substance. And so an Ecuadorian doctor contacted me. He says, you know, I have patients who take the vine every day in the tea. And they do well, and they say it works for their Parkinson's disease. Maybe, should you help me design a study? So we did a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. And sure enough, it was really helpful, slowness and rigidity, but it tended to worsen tremors. Movement Disorder Journal didn't accept it, even though I had assayed. The only part that we did in the United States was to measure the constituents of the vine, because it's harmine, tetrahydroarmine. So we got the vine in the United States, we did the extracts. It was a really good study. The only place it could be published was a review of alternative medicine. But since then, I've been contacted by, this was published quite a while ago, but Andrew Lees, who's one of the well-known movement disorder experts in London, has been in contact with me about that paper, and he would like to repeat the study, a larger scale study. So we're going to design it, and it's going to take place in Ecuador again. And we're going to do a few more sophisticated measurements. So the idea is that if a drug is withheld because it's a potential hallucinogen, well, levodopa is a potential hallucinogen. Mirapex is probably powerful hallucinogen if you take it at too high a dose. Belladonna alkaloids, we use them all the time, but at high doses they're witch's brews. So every drug has adverse effects. And most psychotropic drugs that we use for neurological conditions at high doses produce delirium, confusion, etc. So that shouldn't be an obstacle to the use of cannabinoids for Parkinson's disease. I think I have one more question I can answer.
How cheap is living in Ecuador?
Pardon?
How cheap is it for housing down in Ecuador? I go down for your study.
In Quito, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you'd have to see Dr. Serrano, and we don't have the study organized, but the reason, what's held back this kind of study, because we would be using extracts from the vine, just like the studies with cannabis use extracts from the plant. I think it would be very difficult. It's very important to have quality control as to what's in that vine, and that's what we thought we could do. That's the part we'll contribute. But the major obstacle has been funding for these kinds of studies. There's no pharma company supporting it. It's just academics and people who are just curious, who are scientists. So one of the things is one of his patients gave him a lot of money to organize a study. So now we'll have funding, but to get it done in England or the States would be a big headache. Maybe in 5 years we could get it pushed through to get an IND from the FDA, etc. Because it's considered a controlled substance. It's a hallucinogen, for God's sake. Okay, I think that's it.
Thanks a lot.